I said at the outset that we were going to distinguish several senses of consciousness, and I suggested access consciousness and phenomenal consciousness would be two very important senses. We're going to walk towards phenomenal consciousness, but there's a little bit of a journey. We need first to introduce a term of art introduced by this chap here, Dave Chalmers, who published some very influential papers back in the 1990s that set the scene for a new way of talking about how science and consciousness might approach each other, a question that still is not resolved. In his contribution, he tried to distinguish between what he called the easy problems of consciousness and the hard problem of consciousness. We've got to tease apart that distinction if we're going to understand what phenomenal consciousness is. His contribution was remarkable in that it not only occurred in the philosophy journals, but also in the popular science magazine, Scientific American, and that is required reading for you for this week. So we've met access consciousness, and that, for Chalmers, belongs to the larger set of easy questions about consciousness. And by easy, he does not mean that it's easy to get an answer to anything, or that it's easy to unlock the secrets of consciousness. What he means by a set of easy questions is that these questions can, in theory, be addressed using standard scientific practices, using method, using the concept of objectivity in a familiar manner. So the kind of science we have now is suited for elaborating these questions. Whether that ever produces any insight or not is not the question. The question is, can the methods of science that we currently have, in theory, explore these questions? And we've seen how access consciousness can be studied in this manner. Now let's look at another sense of the term consciousness that also belongs in the set of so-called easy questions. We use the word consciousness in an entirely different sense when we refer to state of consciousness. So when we distinguish between someone who is sleeping, someone who is awake, someone who is in a coma, someone who is on drugs, someone who is in hypnosis, someone who is psychotic, these don't refer to any single thing. They rather refer to states of the whole organism, it must be said. And these are very important distinctions. And unlike many of the questions that arise around consciousness, we're quite comfortable talking about the difference between sleep and awake, or between a coma and hypnosis, for example. Even if we don't understand what's going on, our everyday labels here are very useful. So we can use the term consciousness to draw this distinction when we say this is one state of consciousness or this is another state of consciousness. That's not the same sense as access consciousness, but it is a sense that we can use and is useful. And furthermore, it's relatively easy, in Dave Chalmers' sense at least, to use the established methods of science to explore this notion of states of consciousness. Scientific investigation of states of consciousness takes the shape of, for example, reading EEG, recordings made from people who are in sleep or awake, and contrasting the two. That doesn't mean we know how to interpret the EEG signal, but it means we can use it as a diagnostic to distinguish states of consciousness and perhaps even to make finer distinctions that we couldn't have made without the EEG. So while there's lots to explore here, and it's not clear that there's a meaningful single sense in play here, so psychosis covers all kinds of problems, for example, this is a useful way that we can use the word consciousness and conduct science, and it's compatible with the kind of science that we already conduct, and so this belongs in Dave Chalmers' easy set. Here's another easy question, so-called. One can ask, as some have, what are the neural correlates of consciousness? Now, this doesn't start off by making any metaphysical claims. It says there's things you want to talk about that relate to consciousness, and you're going to use your everyday vocabulary. There's things you can measure in brains using neuroimaging technologies, for example. And when they correlate, that's of interest. So one popular exponent of this view is a guy called Christoph Koch. And he has, for example, a standard representational view of the brain as performing computations which instantiate representations of an external world. That's the Cartesian picture you see at the top there. And so one thing you can do if you are working from this kind of assumption is you can say, okay, I'm going to show you a dog and I'm going to see what varies in your brain, what correlates with the presentation of the image of a dog, and somehow that's going to be of interest as we explore this particular theory of mind. Now, there are drawbacks to this. This doesn't give an unvarnished view of what the brain is or does. We are always relying on people's self-report. That is, I ask you, what do you see? You tell me what you see, and I look to see what correlated with that. The neural correlates of consciousness here is employing the term consciousness not in the same sense as when we distinguish states of consciousness, but more like in the sense of access consciousness. I'm going to ask you what's in your consciousness, and I'm going to look to see what correlates with that. So it's very similar in many respects to the notion of access consciousness. And we've met one more at least of these so-called easy questions, which is when we adopt an information processing view of vision, and we look at neural correlates of seeing. We can identify two different pathways, the dorsal stream and the ventral stream. We met that before. And yet we have the puzzling plain fact that we don't seem to have two kinds of visual experience. We only seem to have one kind of visual experience. And so we can ask questions about how whatever's going on in those two streams might overcome this duality. Are there long-range connections between them? Is the activity in the dorsal stream really independent of that in the ventral stream? That's a problem known as the binding problem, and it can be addressed using standard scientific methodologies, for example, by obtaining brain recordings from the ventral stream and from the dorsal stream and looking to see, do they co-vary or are they independent of each other? Now, we don't know the full answer to this. All our views of brain are works in progress, and there is no definitive answer here. But we can imagine finding a partially satisfying answer here, for example, if we find long-range synchronizations among brain areas. So although this is difficult science to do, it belongs in the set of easy questions because the kind of science that we have is in principle capable of addressing this. But now we come to what's called the hard question. And this is what I mean by the term phenomenal consciousness. The hard question asks, why does anything feel like anything at all? The hard question assumes the existence of a private domain called subjective experience, which is in principle not observable. And because it's in principle not observable, it's very difficult to address this scientifically because science requires observation of some sort. Now, the manner in which we work out this question, the questions around this, ties us up in linguistic knots sometimes, and it's liable to cause misunderstanding. Some terms of art have been introduced here. I'm not sure they're terribly helpful. One is the notion of qualia. Qualia refers to the raw feel of experience. I don't know if that refers to anything, but that's just how the word is intended. So, as well as listing all the facts of where red stands in the rainbow and how red compares to blue and how I like red, somehow there's the feeling of seeing red, if you go along with this notion of qualia. Redness is the one usually expressed, but perhaps pain makes this clearer. I think we can all agree there's something that it feels like to feel pain, and no matter how much you describe it, there's still this feel that needs some account of. And the inherent first-person, non-observable nature of these seems to put them in tension with the attempts of science to construct so-called objective pictures. Furthermore, these raw fields, if they exist, seem to play no causal role in any account we can give of brains and behaviour. So they're ineffable because you can say all the words and you still can't transmit the feel. They're intrinsic, they belong to a person somehow, but they're private and not observable. And in a sense, they are assumed to be the direct contents of consciousness. Now, supposing one didn't like this term, and I don't like this term, but supposing one approached this by denying qualia, then what you would be saying is that raw feelings, lived experience, is something of an illusion. Now this creates more problems. Supposing you met someone and they looked, walked and talked like a person, but it turned out they were not a person, they were actually a machine of some sort, or let's say a zombie. So here's where zombies enter the cognitive science picture. Again, Dave Chalmers is to blame for this. It's a thought experiment. Could you imagine someone who's physically indistinguishable from a real person, but who does not have qualia, for whom the fields don't exist? Is that comprehensible? Does it make any sense? The question is not do they exist. The question is this a possible thing that could exist? And developing this question further, we end up with very serious philosophical questions about what the nature of our relation to other beings is, and how it comes that we actually treat each other as if we were all sharing reality. One little thought experiment that might help here to think about qualia comes from this. Imagine, if you will, a neuroscientist called Mary who's been raised in a bizarre environment in which everything is black and white, carefully controlled. And in this bizarre world, she trains as a neuroscientist, reads all the books, knows pretty much everything that science has to say about neuroscience of brains, reads all the cognitive psychology books as well, and philosophy, whatever. But she's never actually seen a colour. And you have. What do you know that Mary does not know, no matter how many books she reads? It's a thought experiment, and you'll find it discussed as well in this week's required reading.